How many of you have been here for the first two series so far, the first two classes we've done in this? Okay, so you kind of get an idea of what we're doing. What we've been doing in here is John had 3 weeks where he was going to be gone. And so he asked if I'd be willing to fill in for him. I call myself a blue-collar Bible teacher and preacher. My favorite thing to do is to simply open up the Word of God and go verse by verse. So to do something like this is a little bit unusual for me, but there's a place for it. And what we've actually done over the course of the last couple of weeks here is looked at a topic that I think is becoming a fairly critical topic today. And it has to do with whether or not we can take the book of Genesis, especially chapters 1, 2, and 3, and potentially 1 through 11, as literal, historical, chronological fact. And so it basically, I've been asked on a number of occasions whether or not it really matters. Because the tendency in the church today is to say, well, it really doesn't matter. There's just a variety of opinions, and it really doesn't matter what we do with that, and we should not debate it or talk about it. And I don't agree with that at all. And so I put together 3 different weeks to, I think, prove the point that it does matter how we actually interpret the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And again, I use this loosely. Sometimes I'll say the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Sometimes I'll say the first 4. Sometimes I'll say Genesis 1 through 11, because it varies. There are some who take the first 3 chapters as literal, but don't take the flood as literal. Genesis chapter 11. There are others that will take Genesis 4 and Cain and Abel literal, but won't take Genesis 1, 2, and 3 literal. So you'll hear me use that interchangeably, but I'm really referring to the early chapters of the book of Genesis. Does it really matter how we actually interpret those? And I'm going to say yes, that it does. We've looked at this through 3 different avenues. The first one was the first week, and I claim that it does matter how we look at those early chapters of Genesis because our hermeneutics matter, and that's just a fancy word that Seminoid Greek or geeks like I use, and it simply means the rules for interpreting the Scriptures. Just like any language, there are rules for interpreting things. Can you imagine if any one of us got dropped in the middle of China and nobody explained the rules to us for interpreting the language? How much more difficult that would be to be able to learn the language? Every language has rules as to how the grammar works and how syntax works and everything else. And so when it comes to hermeneutics, we have rules. One of the first classes we get taught in seminary is a class on hermeneutics. You don't get to go on into the exegesis classes, which are where you learn to apply all the rules, until you learn the rules. And so that's called hermeneutics. And so my point as we talked about this was that it matters how we interpret Genesis because the rules matter. We can't just throw these rules out. And what we find today is that generally speaking, the rules are just getting thrown out. They just don't matter anymore. Or last week what we dealt with was basically the place that man holds in creation. One of the things that often gets overlooked in the discussion about whether it matters how we interpret Genesis chapter 1 is that mankind is at the heart and center of God's plan. In fact, as we get into Genesis 1, and we actually did this last week, where we went through some of the verses where as you go through Genesis chapter 1, it becomes very clear that when God creates things like the plants or the animals, that they have a human focus to them. That God specifically created things to serve mankind, and the idea is that He never intended for the creation to exist without mankind on it. Genesis chapter 1 is filled with that. We also have places like in Isaiah and Jeremiah that make it very clear that God did not intend for creation to exist without man. So from the very beginning, we see that God intended for Adam and Eve and then their descendants to exist at the very beginning of creation. And that oftentimes gets overlooked when we say things like, well, it really doesn't matter. The earth is billions and billions of years old, and then do what Hugh Ross does, which is to say man shows up in the last few final seconds. Basically completely ignores that the reason God created everything was to serve as a habitat for mankind. And so we spent last week doing that. John does not have that up online yet. He tells me he will have that. He's been on vacation and he's been sick. Both him and his wife ended up in the emergency room or whatever because of their colds and I guess some bronchitis. And so I talked to them a couple nights ago for about a half hour. He just sounded horrible. So he's hopefully feeling a little bit better here, but he's going to get the last week's up online here probably about the same time he does today's. So what are we going to do today? My last point is that it matters because the New Testament actually quotes the Old Testament all the time. And it actually quotes the book of Genesis almost 200 times, or alludes to it, quotes or alludes to it. And a lot of those quotes are right from the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. So the question that I would pose is, if Jesus and Peter and Paul and Jude and others in the New Testament treated Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 as literal, historical, and chronological, shouldn't we? That gets ignored today. They'll ignore what Jesus does with the text. They'll ignore what Peter and Paul do with the text. And I say, we can't do that. One of the other rules of hermeneutics is you allow the Bible to interpret itself, which means if I want to know whether I should take Genesis 1 through 11 as literal history, I should see what others did with it in the New Testament. So we're going to look at that today, okay? We're going to go ahead and just sort of break that down. But let's kind of break this down just so we have a pretty good idea of where we're at. The first week, we basically looked at this. For the first 1,750 years of the church, they treated Genesis chapter 1 as literal, historical, chronological history. There's no dispute. You'll find some individuals, Hugh Ross and Francis Collins and some of the other old earth proponents will make arguments like, well, Augustine didn't take it literally. Well, that's not true. You go back and you read all of Augustine's writings. What Augustine did was he said the days were literal 24-hour days. It's just that they represented future periods of time. But he still treated them as literal historical events. Okay, so if they looked at everything the church fathers did, universally they said for the first 1,700 years of the church that Genesis was literal history, even the first few chapters. It wasn't until the theories of evolution and something called uniformitarianism, which uniformitarianism simply means that everything is as it is today. Sounds a lot like what Peter says. Everything is just unchanged from the beginning. Well, it became very popular about the 1750s to simply say, hey, we can look at today and see exactly what happened 4, 5, then 10, 20, 30 million, 100 million years ago, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3. In other words, nothing's changed. It all just continues on as it is. It's called uniformitarianism. And what's really funny about that is that still drives this discussion in the church about whether we can take Genesis literally. But now scientists are even saying that uniformitarianism might not even be a valid theory anymore. And they're now starting to allow for catastrophic events because they no longer even believe. Interesting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as long as it isn't a literal flood. Okay? So what happened is the church basically began to say, how can we have both our scientific consensus be true and the Bible be true? And they began to try to put those together, and they began to compromise the Scriptures. In other words, reinterpret the Scriptures. Well, in the 1950s, John Whitcomb and Henry Morris came out with their book on the flood. And a pretty amazing thing happened. People started to return to the Scriptures and give emphasis to the Scriptures, and we had this resurgence of young earth theology, where they began to reinterpret the science in light of the wisdom revealed by God and through the Scriptures and whatnot. And so you had this resurgence of young earth theology until about the last 20 years or so, and it's begun to swing the other way. And so basically what we discovered in that first week was this, that the old earth view, there's three primary problems with it. One of them is it values scientific consensus and human wisdom and observation over special revelation, which is really what it does. It gives precedence to what we see and what we can evaluate on our own. Secondly, it abandons sound hermeneutical principles. They just throw out the rules. And then lastly, it doesn't allow for the supernatural. In other words, when you have somebody say, well, there's no way to have light before the sun, that ignores the supernatural. When they say God could not have created Adam from the dust of the ground, that ignores the supernatural. And the problem with that is, what happens when you get in the New Testament? You have Jesus making wine from water. Scientifically, you can't do that, folks. What about the resurrection? You can't have the resurrection because science tells us once you're dead, you're dead. So if you're going to toss out the supernatural in the Old Testament, and I think I shared this last week or the week before, that you're finding an amazing number of old earth proponents that now throw out the flood as well. It was not a true universal flood. Why? Creep. We used to call this project creep in the IT world, where you start on a project and the project is supposed to be about one thing, but all of a sudden it creeps and you have all these other things. Well, you find the same thing with theology. If it starts in Genesis chapter 1, it's going to creep to the rest. Guarantee it, folks. It's already happening. Okay? So that was the first week. Second week was this. Mankind existed in the heart and the mind of God prior to creation. We find that throughout the Scriptures. In fact, we're told in Ephesians chapter 1 that God even saved us before creation. That's an amazing concept. I don't really understand all of it. But the reality of it is, God planned for mankind before he did everything else. There's a divinely intended relationship between mankind and creation. It's interesting that the curse would affect the earth. Why did the curse, man's sin, actually, according to Paul, corrupt physically corrupt the earth, because there's this divinely intended relationship that exists between mankind and creation. Why did God destroy all the animals and the earth at the flood as a result of man's sin? Because there's a divinely intended relationship between the two. God intended it that way. It was to serve us, it was to meet our needs, it was to provide for us, and it was to give us something to do as well by basically overseeing God's creation as his overseer made in his image. So there's this divine relationship between the two. So God did not plan for the earth to exist apart from mankind, which is why he created him immediately after creating everything else. There are a number of elements. We looked at this last week. If you look at just the Genesis account, in Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, there are some neat things that happen in the text that give us an indication of what God intended. The fact that when he creates the plants, he specifically mentions in there that some of those plants were created specifically to serve as food for mankind. Why would that be there if God didn't intend for mankind to exist for 4.5 billion years? What about the celestial bodies? We're told that they were specifically created for signs for us, to tell time and for telling seasons. We went through a liturgy of some of the things that we can do, telling years and dates and whatnot based on that. Why would God do that if for 4.5, actually in the case of the universe, 13 to 20 billion years prior to man existing? They don't serve a purpose. We have domestic animals created in the very beginning of creation. Why would God create domestic animals that require care and are used as provision for mankind, food and for labor, for farming, etc., if mankind was not expected to be on the earth for billions, not millions, but billions of years after they were created? Now, evolution will tell us they weren't created at that time. But Genesis tells us they were. They were created just the day prior or before man. And then you look at the purpose of mankind being created to oversee. Specifically, Adam and Eve were told that they were created for subduing, placing the earth in subjection to themselves, and ruling over it, which implies that God created the earth to be ruled over and to be in subjection. So, we looked at all those things the last couple of weeks. Now, let's go ahead and look at this week here. Something interesting here. The book of Genesis is actually referred to by every single New Testament book except for Philemon, 2 John, and 3 John. It is the foundation, not just for the Old Testament, but for the New. There's a reason we place that first. Okay, it wasn't the first book written, but through God's just amazing supernatural work, he saw fit to move man as we arranged the canon of Scripture. We didn't create the canon, but as we arranged the books, we decided to put Genesis first for some strange reason. Well, it's because it's the foundation. And again, every New Testament book except for these three actually quote from the book of Genesis because it's the foundation. It's referred to almost 200 times. 43 of the 50 chapters in Genesis are quoted. So almost the entire book, now not every single verse, but almost every single chapter of Genesis at some point is referred to in the New Testament. Half of those New Testament references come from the first 11 chapters. How important do you think the first 11 chapters of Genesis are? Look at this. 63 are from the first 3 chapters of Genesis. How important do you think the first 3 chapters of Genesis are? The authors of the New Testament believe they were critical. And then 14 references are from the flood chapters because it is also extremely critical. It's chapters 6 through 8. And this actually, I put the citation down here. It'll be up on the website. It's from creationstudies.org. So let's go ahead and get into this. My premise today is this. We're going to look at a number of authors or individuals in the New Testament and how they treated the first 4 chapters of the book of Genesis. So you need your Bibles this morning. We're going to be going through a lot. Some people would say it's going to be a little overwhelming in the sense that we're just going to go through a lot of Scripture today. I don't see how that can be a bad thing. But part of my purpose today is I want you to walk away not just going, Peter talked about it. Paul made a mention of it. I want you to walk away today overwhelmed with the amount of information. Now, I want you to go, wow, it wasn't just Peter, it was Paul, and it was Jude, and it was the book of Revelation, and it was John. I want you to walk out of here going, everybody treated it as literal history, because that's the truth. And the only way we can do that is in volume. So that's what we're going to do today. We're not going to go into great depth. We're going to do some volume. So, let's look at how Jesus actually did it. Jesus treated the early chapters of Genesis as literal history. I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 19, if you would. Matthew chapter 19. Jesus is in a discussion with the Pharisees on divorce. And what happens are the Pharisees come to Jesus and they want to basically have him answer a very simple question. It says this, verse 3 of chapter 19, some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And Jesus responds, like any good rabbi should, verse 4, have you not read? Meaning, well, take a look at the Old Testament. There's your answer. Go back to the Old Testament. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So Jesus does two things here. One is he simply references the creation story. And he says, look, when God created marriage, what did he do? He did it at the time that he created male and female. So Jesus specifically states God's creation of male and female. And he says what? It happened when? In the beginning. Now, some have said, well, he's not really referencing the beginning of creation. He's referencing the beginning of the creation of Adam and Eve. No, he simply says in the beginning, which is a reference, an exact quote from Genesis chapter 1, is it not? And he specifically states he created a male and female. So he basically says that God created a male and a female. Now, what some progressive evolutionists will say here, or progressive creationists, or even some theistic evolutionists will basically say that Adam and Eve were not literal, or they simply they are sort of this allegorical way to refer to some humanoid that evolved into some human form at some point, and that it's all allegory. But that the simplest reading of this text is not that it's allegory. The first rule of interpretation is you take it at face value unless something in the text compels you to treat it a different way. Nothing in the text the simplest reading, my daughter understands this, folks. My 7-year-old, when she reads this, if you were to ask her, she said, well, no, he's talking about Genesis. That's the easiest way to take this. Nothing compels us to take it otherwise. The other thing he does is he actually quotes from Genesis chapter 2. He quotes the literal text. And he says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then Jesus uses this as a basis for his teaching on marriage and divorce. Verse 6, so then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Do you think Jesus took that literally? He uses it as the basis. He says, look, because of what happened in Genesis 1 and 2, it is not right for a man to divorce his wife and marry somebody else. Because they have become one flesh. Let me ask you this. How can that be true if it's an allegory? It can't be. It's not true. It's allegory. Jesus didn't treat it as allegory. It became the basis for his teaching on marriage and divorce. Why? Because he took it literally. There was a literal Adam, a literal Eve, created at the beginning and brought together in a marriage relationship by God. What else does Jesus do? Look at Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, verse 35. We're going to start in verse 34. Therefore, behold, I am sending you the prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. So he's talking about real persecution here, right? So upon that, that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth. Okay? It refers to the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. Is Zechariah a real individual? Of course. But somehow we're to believe that Abel here was not. He was Genesis chapter 4. If there was no literal Adam and Eve, there could not have been a literal Abel descendant of Adam and Eve. Plain and simple. But yet Jesus here is talking about literal blood shed on the literal earth from literal prophets. And we know one of them here, Zechariah, is definitely real, but we're supposed to somehow assume that Abel was not. Jesus didn't treat it that way. Jesus referred to Abel as a literal prophet, a human being whose blood had been shed unrighteously. And so Jesus again cites an example from the Old Testament all the way back to Genesis chapter 4 where he understood Abel to be a real, literal human being. And again, there's no way Abel could have been a literal human being, a literal descendant of Adam and Eve if Adam and Eve were allegorical. So what we find here is that Jesus didn't take chapter 4, at least, as allegorical. He took the killing of of Cain as actual history and used it as a judgment here. How about John chapter 8? Let's go to John chapter 8. We're in verse 44. This is an interesting one. The Jews are basically claiming that Abraham is their father, but they're not acting like Abraham, and so Jesus is judging them. And he tells them in verse 41 here, you are doing the deeds of your father. He's not referring to Abraham. They're basically saying, hey, we're of Abraham. Jesus is going to tell them otherwise. Look at verse 44. If God were your father, you would love me, for I proceed forth and have come from God, for I have not even come on my own initiative, but he has sent me. Why do you not understand what I am saying? It is because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. And look at this reference here. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. I believe that's a reference back to the garden. The murder there he's talking about is the murdering of Adam and Eve, ultimately. The lie that he told to Adam and Eve in the garden led to their death. That's what the scriptures tell us. The fact that he says here he was the father of lies means that he was the originator of the lie. Where do we find the first lie? Genesis chapter 3. Jesus is not quoting Genesis 3, but alluding to Genesis 3 here. Yes?
What verse did you start in?
I started up in verse 41, where he says, your deeds are of your real father, who's obviously Satan here. So again, we don't have a direct quote here, but we do have an allusion, we call it, a reference back. Jesus refers to the devil as ultimately a murderer and the father of lies because of what he did in Genesis chapter 3, where it all began. So certainly Jesus did not take those first few chapters of Genesis as anything other than literal history. Now, granted, Jesus does not say, hey, those are 6 literal days. We don't get into that debate here. The reason was there wasn't a debate at the time. They didn't debate the historicity or literalness of Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. It just is assumed. And we find that here with Jesus. All right, how about Paul? Let's go to Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. How did Paul actually treat these first few chapters of Genesis? Romans 5, we're starting in verse 12. Paul says this, therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. What is Paul referring to here when he says in verse 12, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world? Right, we know the reference there is to Adam, right? Okay. Now, what some will argue is that, well, it's still allegorical. Adam didn't need to be a literal historical figure for what Paul's about to say to be true. That it could have been allegorical. But then how do you get literal sin into the human race through an allegorical individual? It doesn't happen. Right? That's like creating something out of nothing, which only God can do. But God's not the author of sin. Okay? Let's go on. He says in verse 14, nevertheless, death reigned from who? Adam until Moses. Now we're talking about actual death. How did death come about? How did it reign? Well, it came about from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam. It's interesting here. Sinned in the likeness of Adam. Paul also treated the sin of Adam as literal historical sin as well. Not allegorical. So we're finding that he's treating Adam here as a literal historical individual. He also treats death as having originated with Adam as a historical fact. And he references Adam's sin as a historical fact. There's no allegory here. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses. even for those who hadn't sinned like him, in the likeness of the offensive Adam, who is a type of him who is to come. But the free gift is not like the transgression, for if by the transgression of the one, the many died, so he ties all of our spiritual deaths and physical death ultimately here to one man, Adam, and what Adam did. Much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, abound to the many. The gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. Again, a historical fact here. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from one transgression, resulting in condemnation, but on the other hand, the free gift arose from the many transgressions, resulting in justification. Verse 18, let's jump down there. So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. And he goes on. We can do this all the way through verse 21. What's Paul's point here? Paul's talking actually about resurrection. And to prove his point that one man can save all the rest of us, goes all the way back to the fact that one man could have condemned all of us. So what we basically have is Paul arguing for the reality of the resurrection, basing it on a historical fact, because it's the only thing that can make that true. He can't argue that resurrection can come to all of us as a result of one man, Jesus Christ, and then use allegory to prove it. That doesn't make... You guys wouldn't let me get away with that, would you? If I tried to prove something to you and simply use things that were untrue or myth, you wouldn't accept that. But why do we want to accept that with Paul? And that's what we're told to do. That Adam and Eve were not literal human beings. Your most popular old earth proponents today, like Hugh Ross and others, Hugh Ross is a little bit iffy because he believes that God kind of recreated or, continued to create, and so he does believe in a literal Adam and Eve, just not the same way that we would. But people like Francis Collins and even Trimper Longman, the individual I mentioned last week, doesn't believe in a literal Adam and Eve. But yet that becomes a basis for what Paul does to argue that we're all going to be raised from the dead as a result of one man's righteousness. And again, the argument makes no sense, because we have to deal with the fact that either Paul was deceived, because there's nothing in this text that indicates Paul thought it was allegory. In fact, he treats it as historical fact. And he's able to do that then to make his point that one man can bring salvation because one man brought sin. Does that make sense? I'm not overstretching here? I must be in good company then. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I'll be dealing with this passage in a couple of weeks here. I'm teaching the first hour ABF I teach is New Beginnings, and actually we're going through 1 Corinthians right now verse by verse. So I'll be dealing with this in a couple of weeks. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. It takes us all the way through verse 20. And I know I'm kind of hopping through the text. It's something I don't like to do, but just volume of time. So we go through as much as we can here. But chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians, verse 12 and following. All things are lawful for me, but all things are not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food, but God will do away with both of them. Yet the body is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. He's talking about immorality here. Let's jump down to verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? May it never be. Look at verse 16. Or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one with her? For he says, the two shall become one flesh. So what's he saying there? Why does he quote? That's actually a quote from Genesis chapter 2. What is it, verse 24? Why does he quote that? He's basically making an argument that what the Corinthian, presumably men were doing here, if you know much about Corinth, Corinth actually had a temple up on the Acropolis. It was a temple to Athena. And evidence indicates that there were probably 1,000 to 2,000 prostitutes that most likely lived at that temple or at least worshipped at that temple. And these prostitutes would come down in the city in the daytime and would engage in sexual activity with the men and possibly women, not really sure, but at least the men. And Paul has to deal with that in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapters 5 and 6. And what he's basically doing is he's telling these men, this is wrong. You cannot unite yourself with a prostitute. And then he quotes from Genesis chapter 2. He can't use allegory to make a moral statement about sex with prostitutes. It doesn't make any sense. So I believe if we look at Paul, we look at the last verse that he quoted, we look at this, he's treating Genesis chapter 2 as a real thing that really happened. At some point, God took Adam and took Eve and brought them together, and we're told the two shall become one flesh. Those are Adam's words. So what we basically do is we have Paul here quoting a non-existent person. Right? Because Adam didn't exist. And somehow we can use the words of a non-existent human being for an event, marriage, that never really happened to prove that you shouldn't sleep with prostitutes. Makes no sense. Paul thought it was real. We've seen that in Romans chapter 5. We see it here. 1 Corinthians, look at chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul is talking actually about the headship of man over woman when it comes to a marriage relationship. And here he does something else that's kind of interesting. I love this passage because he does more than simply reference it. And I'll get to that in just a second. But if you start in, he's talking to them about what's going on in the church. The Corinthians, it appears, as best we can tell, that the Corinthian women were taking their head coverings off in the church. And Paul says we didn't have a tradition to do that. And the reason was, in that particular culture, the only ones that revealed their head, or took the head covering off were prostitutes. So basically what Paul was saying is, you women now in your newfound freedom are coming into the church and you're taking your head coverings off, you look like prostitutes. And you shouldn't be doing that. And that's why he says, if you want to take your head covering off, you might as well shave your head, because that's what they did to prostitutes. So the issue isn't that God demands head coverings, it's that in that particular culture and time, the only women that did not wear the head coverings were the prostitutes. So Paul said it's not appropriate for you to look like prostitutes. Okay? So he's challenging them on that. So he gets into chapter 11, verses 1 and following, and he tells them, be imitators of me. In other words, do what I've shown you to do. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. Okay, so he makes a statement here that man is the head of woman. Okay? Verse 4, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. In other words, you look like a prostitute when you do that. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off, so let her cover her head. In other words, it's not going to look right with your head shaved, so don't uncover your head so we don't have to shave your head. Goes on and says in verse 7 that a man should not cover his head when he's praying. Again, it violated the cultural standards and norms, etc. For man does not originate from woman. Get that? Verse 8. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from the man. What's that a reference to? Yeah. Evolution doesn't account for that. But yet, we're expected to believe by some old earth proponents, Christians, that claim that we just all evolved. But Paul says that, no, woman actually came from man. Well, that's what we find in Genesis chapter 2. That God took from the side. In fact, when you look at the account in Genesis chapter 2, I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, there's a really cool thing that happens. There's a word picture, and this is very common in Hebrew, and it's a teaching tool to us. Adam, we're told, was taken from the ground. He was even given a name that represented that. The word for ground is Adamah. Adam's name is Adam. So he was given a name that represented where he came from. But not only where he came from, what he was to do, because God then placed him back to till and work the ground, we're told. So Adam was taken from the ground because he had this relationship with the ground. And then when he sins, his curse actually is in relationship to the ground. The ground is cursed because of him, and it says that the thorns and thistles will be brought up as he works the ground. Then, at the end of chapter 3, where he's booted out of the garden, we're told that he was sent out of the garden to continue to work the ground, the text says. So you get this great word picture. Adam taken from the ground, placed back into the ground to work the ground, cursed in relationship with the ground, and then sent out of the garden to work the ground. Eve, we have a different picture. Her relationship isn't with the ground, it's with the man. And what we're told is God says he took from Adam. All the animals were taken from the ground. Adam was taken from the ground. Why didn't God just make another woman or take a woman from the ground? Because that wasn't his purpose. He was going to create the woman to have the relationship with the man. Adam's relationship was primarily with God's creation, as overseer, as head. So what does he do? He puts man to sleep and takes from the side of man, creates the woman. Then what happens? She is given a name that represents that. The Hebrew word for man is Ish. Woman is Isha. So God gives her a name, actually Adam does, to represent her relationship. What's her curse in relationship to? The ground? Absolutely not. It's in relation to childbearing and her relationship with her husband. And so we get this neat word picture that actually happens there. The fact that Eve was taken from Adam is extremely important because it becomes the basis for headship. The role of the husband and the role of the wife in the marriage relationship. And Paul cites that right here. That woman came from the man. Did Paul take Genesis chapter 2 literally? Absolutely. He didn't treat it as allegorical. He didn't allow room for evolution, that somehow male and female both came somehow through chance and billions of years or millions of years of evolution. I'll let you read the rest of that, but he goes through that. And he makes that very clear that man didn't come from her, she came from man. And he uses that as an argument for establishing the role of headship and helpmate in the marriage relationship. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 4 times in one book. How important do you think the first couple of chapters of Genesis were to Paul and his argument to the Corinthians? You know why this is important, folks? It's important because when it came to Greek culture and whatnot, there was a fascination with this, with just how things came about and origins and whatnot. And so while oftentimes Paul, as he debates with Jews, is quoting other parts related to the prophets and whatnot, when it came to the Greeks, he used the first few chapters of Genesis because they were so into the philosophy and wisdom and whatnot. It was important to them through observation and what they could see and learn through what they saw. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 20. Look at verses 20 and 22. He says, "But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by man came death, by a man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive." So again, he uses the literalness of Adam and the fact that death came through Adam to then use that to support the fact that life can now come through one man, Jesus Christ, and ultimately resurrection. If you were to come to me and I wasn't a believer and you were to say, hey, I can prove that, or I can talk to you about resurrection coming from one man. One man died for you. And I might say, how could one man do that? You could look at me and you could say, well, you know what? Death came to all men through one person, through the literal person of Adam. And if that's possible, might not it also be possible that salvation can come through one man? That is a logical argument. If, however, you said, one man can die for you and bring about the resurrection, and I would say no, and you would say, well, you know what, I'm going to tell you a fable. And then try to use that fable to substantiate that, I'd look at you like you were a fool. You can't use an untruth or myth to try to support truth. It doesn't work. So here, Paul does that in 1 Corinthians. Look at verses 42 through 49, same chapter, 42 through 49. "So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body, it's raised an imperishable body. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So also, as it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last man became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not the first, but the natural, then the spiritual. The first man is from the earth." Gee, that sounds like exactly what happened in Genesis, doesn't it? The first man is from the earth. The second man is from heaven. Well, I think we've got one part of that at least is literal. Christ came from heaven, we know that. Wouldn't the first half of this be true as well? The first man came from the earth. "As is the earthly, so also are those who are earthly," and he goes on, but basically what we have here is 4 times in the book, actually 5 times if you count twice in the book or in the chapter 15, 5 times Paul, in making his arguments for death reigning in man and sin being the cause, to sexual immorality, to resurrection, to the doctrine of headship in marriage, Paul goes back to the literalness, the historical fact of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. No question that Paul treated it that way. But yet somehow we're supposed to ignore that. And we're supposed to say now, no, it's not literal. No, it's not historical. The problem with this is that arguments that Jesus made and that Paul made fall apart if Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are not literal history. So what happens here? We begin to lose our doctrines of immorality, our doctrines of sin and death, our doctrines of headship and marriage. What right do I have to look at my lovely wife, Amy, and say that I am your head? I have no right if Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is not true. Because God didn't establish it that way. It's just the product of evolution, and I happen to be male, she happens to be female. I have no right. But I am her head, because God made me her head, and He established that in the historicity of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And that's why Paul can use it here. Let's go on. Who else? Paul actually does it in 2 Corinthians. Look at 2 Corinthians 11:3, just a small reference. I think Paul happens to like this, doesn't he? Seems to refer to it enough. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. Paul's talking about his apostleship. He says this, "But I am afraid that, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ." He references both the serpent and Eve, but also the deception. Okay? Now, it's possible Paul could simply be quoting a story. I could, make an argument to my kids and say, reference Aesop's fables. But what we've seen Paul do so far, we've seen Paul has not treated it as a fable. So I'm led to believe that when Paul refers to Eve and her act of deception and the serpent, that he treated those as literal facts. Because elsewhere he didn't treat them like a story. It wouldn't make sense that he does here. How about Ephesians chapter 5? Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 and 20 or through 33. Paul's actually talking about the marriage relationship here. He's going to deal with headship again and the role of the proper role of the husband and the wife. Starting in verse, let's see here, chapter 5, verse 22. He says, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, and Christ also is the head of the church, He Himself being the Savior of the body." He goes on into verse 25, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself up for her." Then let's jump all the way down to verse 31, where he says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church." What has Paul just done here? He's teaching the Ephesians on the proper relationship between the husband and the wife, and he declares without question that the husband is the head of the wife, and then he calls the wife to be in subjection to that, and later on in verse 33 basically challenges her to respect the authority of her husband. Why? Because it was established this way where? Genesis, which is exactly why Paul quotes from Genesis. He's basically saying, this is the way marriage is. And if you've got a problem with it, you go talk to God about it from Genesis chapter 2. Because God established it. Husband and a wife being joined together in a one flesh relationship where male is the head, female is the helpmate. They come together in this amazing spiritual union. One flesh union. And the only way this becomes even remotely understandable is if it's a historical fact in Genesis chapter 2. Because Paul cannot claim this. If it's myth, if it's story, if it's anything other than history, Paul has no authority to say, hey, husbands, guess what? You're the head, you better act like it. Wives, guess what? He's your head. Respect his authority. Paul can't say that if this is just fable, because there's nothing to base it in. But again, he goes to the historicity of Genesis chapter 2 to make a point about the proper relationship between a husband and a wife. So again, if Genesis 2 is not true, then we have no basis for the roles of men and women in the church. And my wife could look at me and say, guess what, hubby? For today, I'm the head. You know what? And I can do it. Because that whole Adam and Eve thing, that's just a story. That's something that Paul told to them because it's something only their culture could possibly understand. Oh, that's the way it was in their culture. Male was the head. The wife was the helpmate. So Paul was catering to them, but today it's no. It goes back to the historical fact that God established it that way at the very beginning, just like Jesus said in Matthew 19. But yet somehow today, we're supposed to say, no, it's just fable. It's just myth. There's some theological truth there, but it's not historical. How about 1 Timothy chapter 3? First Timothy chapter 3, verses 11 through 15, Paul is actually talking about the creation order of Adam and Eve. The primary point of 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul is dealing with the role of women in the church. And apparently, from what we understand, and again, this is somewhat speculative, it appears that there was possibly some heresy floating around, and it had to do with woman being created before the man, and actually reversing the creation story. And there's some evidence that there were some famous women teachers at this particular time that were propagating that false teaching. Again, part of that is speculative, but there seems to be some information related to that. Well, Paul deals with that in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 11 through 15. He says this: women must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things. Deacons must be the husbands of one wife, and and good managers of their children and their own households. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing and great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. I am writing these things to you, hoping to come to you before long. But in case I am delayed, whoops, is this the right one? Hold on a second.
Chapter 2.
That's right, I'm sorry, chapter 2. Let me move back here. Verse 9, I'm sorry. If we jump up to verse 11, a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. In other words, he didn't want the women to be the primary teachers in the church. Later on, he does tell women that women should be teaching the younger women in the church. They should obviously be involved with forms of teaching. It's just that they were not to have the primary teaching role in the church, which was reserved primarily for elders. So he says he wants a woman to quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow women to teach or exercise authority over men, but to remain quiet, or another translation of quiet here is to remain peaceable. In other words, not to cause disruptions. And this is the reason Paul can claim this, for it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. So Paul references a couple of things here. The reason women were not to teach or have authority over men in the church was because they were not created for that purpose. And he says that they were created second. Adam was created first by God, and second created Eve to be a helpmate, to come alongside the husband. But then he also references this concept of Eve being deceived. Now the problem that this does not mean that women are more gullible than men. We can't use it for that. But in the case of Adam and Eve, what happened in the garden? Eve was deceived by the serpent. Adam was not deceived. Adam sinned with his eyes wide open. And Paul uses it as an argument here. Now you can do with that what you will, but God has specifically designed or created the male to serve as the primary authority figure in the marriage relationship and in the church as well. And there may be some things created within that as well that make him more apt to be able to teach and to lead men. That role was not, or the women were not designed for that primary role within the church. Okay? But again, Paul uses a historicity of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 to make his point. What do we have to do with this if that's all myth? You just have to relegate it to, well, in Paul's day and culture, that probably would have made sense, Really? When it's just purely culture and it's only based on culture, then you can twist it any way you want, folks. There's no rules. Just because my culture here says one thing doesn't mean I have to do it by cultural standards. The authority is what God has established. And so Paul goes back to the historicity of Adam and Eve and the deception that happened in the garden and uses that to prove his point, that women should not be teaching or having authority over men in the church. So again, we're left with the historicity of that account. How many times has Paul done this now? 5, 6, 7, 8 times Paul has referred to the Genesis account in a literal, historical sense to prove some of our primary doctrines. And really that's what it amounts to, folks. Here's what's interesting about this. When you look at what a lot of old earth proponents do when it comes to things like sin and death, they'll do this. They'll say, well, really what Paul taught in Romans was that death only came to man as a result of Adam's sin. Didn't come to the animal kingdom. Didn't come to the rest of the world. So what have they done? They just twisted our doctrine. Because what our doctrine has taught us Paul says in Romans that not only has mankind become corrupt, but the earth has become corrupt as well. We're told that very specifically about Paul in Romans 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay? And he basically tells us that the world, the creation, is waiting for the revelation of God's sons before it's actually been redeemed. Because God will redeem the earth from the corruption that it's now under. Okay? So what we find basically is that the Bible tells us that Adam's sin affected not just him, but animal life, the way plants and the rest of the vegetation functions, because it now brings up thorns and thistles. The earth itself does not function the way that it's supposed to because it's now under corruption. But because that doesn't fit with evolution and scientific consensus, what old earth proponents will do with that is they'll say, well, actually, death only came to Adam and mankind, not the world. But that runs contrary to what the scriptures actually say itself. So my point is that anytime we start to change the historicity of that Genesis account, it changes our doctrine as well. Same thing with the flood. When they now say that the flood was not universal, it changes our doctrine because we've been told that it wiped out everybody and everything, not just some or parts or whatnot. Let's go ahead and look at how Luke treated this. What's interesting about Luke is that Luke actually contains more references to the book of Genesis than any other New Testament book. 16 times he actually quotes it, but he only twice refers to Genesis 1 through 4. But Luke relies on the book of Genesis more so than the Apostle Paul. Let's look at Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. And here's an interesting thing about Luke. Actually, let me back up here. An interesting thing about Paul being a Pharisee, he was schooled under some of the best Hebrew teachers of his day. If anybody would have understood whether or not Genesis 1 was allegory or whether it was historical truth, it would have been the Apostle Paul. More educated than most in his generation, and yet he took it literally. Luke, what's the important thing about Luke? Luke was a historian. Luke is keen on facts. Okay? His purpose in writing Acts was to write an accurate account of the early church. That's exactly what he did here. And so we would expect that if Luke uses Genesis 1, 2, or 3 as literal fact and history, it probably is true because that's what Paul was. Luke was. He was a historian. He was a doctor, but he was also a historian. So Luke chapter 3, verse 38. Let's see here. Luke chapter 3, verse 38, if I can get there. He's going through a genealogy here, and it's a genealogy of Jesus. And look at what he does in verse 38. He says, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. He does something rather interesting here. First off, every other person mentioned in this genealogy is a literal human being. But somehow we're supposed to believe that all of a sudden then, Luke skips over millions and millions and millions of years and references somebody who didn't really exist, Adam. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, he very specifically here references Adam, son of who? He could have stopped at Adam, folks. Okay? But he chose not to. Why? Because Adam was literally the son of God in the sense that God made him from the soil. He did not have a natural ancestor. God created him. This is a pretty good clue that Luke understood the historicity of Adam. He includes him in a list of real people. And what's interesting about this is, biblically speaking, there is no gap. If you go back to the genealogies and you look at these individuals, there is no gap between Enosh and Seth, or between Seth and Adam. They are direct descendants, folks. How in the world can a fake Adam come from a... Well, wait a minute, how does that work? Or how about Enosh? How can Enosh come from Seth? Well, Enosh would have to come from Seth, right? Literal. Seth has to come from somebody who is Seth's father. If Adam wasn't real... See my point? It's this foolish discussion and debate. It's just lunacy. So Luke includes Adam in a list of real, literal, historical figures, and then even tells us Adam didn't have a natural father. He was created specifically by God. He was son of God. How about 1151? Oh, and by the way, that's in the genealogy of Jesus. It's pretty important to us, isn't it? Because according to, here's an interesting twist on this. According to theistic evolutionists, where did Jesus come from? He's nothing less than a descendant of a common ancestor that also brought forward the apes. Think about it, folks. If we are to believe theistic evolution, then the individuals Luke mentions here are all products of theistic evolution, Enosh and Seth and others. And since he's using it as a genealogy to talk about the humanness of Jesus Christ, then Jesus Christ himself evolved from a common ancestor like the rest of us, which makes him no different than an animal. I got a problem with that. Luke chapter 11, verse 51. Luke 11:51. And I'll just make a quick reference here. Notice in verse 51, he quotes something Jesus says about the blood of Abel. We've already dealt with this in Jesus too, but Luke even records the fact that Jesus himself referenced Abel as a human being whose blood had been shed. And again, if Abel is a legitimate historical figure whose father was a literal historical Adam, where does that take us? Luke just simply, again, referenced Jesus' quote, but he references Abel as a historical figure. Let's look at a few more of these. I'll just take another 5 minutes or so. We'll breeze through these. I'll give you the references. You can look these up on your own. But the author of Hebrews doesn't do anything different. The book of Hebrews has the second largest number of references back to Genesis, next to Luke. There's 13 of them. Again, I won't go through all of this. I'll let you see the references just for time's sake here. But in chapter 11, verse 4, he also refers to Abel's sacrifice to God to support the fact that faith is a requirement to please God. And so again, we have him establishing a doctrine that faith has always been required. The law wasn't what was required. Faith was required to please God. The law was a tutor ultimately to bring us to Christ. But as the author of Hebrews is, and again, Hebrews is a Hebrew author most likely, understood the Old Testament, he relies upon Abel's sacrifice made in faith as proof that faith is what pleases God. So again, why would he rely upon a myth or an allegory to prove a doctrinal point? It just doesn't make sense. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 24, he again refers to Abel's blood. That's 3 times now in the New Testament, where Abel was referenced as a literal human being who had been killed by his brother Abe and spilled literal blood. Again, not allegorical. How about Peter? Peter did the same thing. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, he talks about the heavens and the earth being created by the word of God, but he also references the fact that the earth was formed out of water, and he treats it as fact. Interesting, if you go back to Genesis, what do we see? Genesis chapters 1 and 2 says that the earth was completely surrounded and immersed in water, and it was out of that God then formed the land or brought the land up. And so when you read 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, again, the impression that you get is that Peter understood that to be literal historical fact. There's nothing allegorical in it. How about John? 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, he again goes back to Cain and Abel. The 4th time Abel is referenced in his discussion of loving one another, and he treats Cain's killing of Abel as a historical event. There's nothing in the text that indicates otherwise. Revelation chapter 20, verse 2. This is another interesting one. He refers to Satan as a serpent of old. Where does that come from? The serpent of old is a reference directly back to Genesis chapter 3. It's a direct reference to that. Serpent in the Garden of Eden. So I think the reason this is important here is when we think about the existence of Satan and the reality of Satan, the fact that John ties him directly to the physical thing that happened in the garden would indicate that he's real. And then Revelation chapter 22, 1 through 6, he simply mentions a tree of life, something we find in Genesis as well, the very beginning in chapter 2. How about Jude? Now we have Cain again. Jude 11 refers to the way of Cain as a direct reference to Cain's murder of Abel. This is another important one. Jude chapter 14, or verse 14, he refers to Enoch as a direct descendant of Adam, and even names the generation. This is important here. You hear a lot of these guys say, oh, the genealogies that you have listed in the Old Testament in chapter 5 of Genesis, as well as what Luke does, there's these giant gaps. I'd like to know how that's possible when they specifically give the age of the parent when he has the next descendant. How can there be millions of years when you are specifically told he was 70 years old when he had this son? How do you fit millions of years into the 70 years? It just does not work. There are absolutely no gaps in the genealogies. That's manufactured, folks. And so he specifically refers to Enoch as a descendant of Adam in the 7th generation. Did he take that literally, do you think? I would, if he took this out, maybe you could say, it's allegory. But he specifically mentions he was the 7th generation. So, what's the conclusion in all this? Just give you a real quick summary here. Does it matter how we interpret the book of Genesis, the first few chapters? Absolutely, because the writers that quoted it all the time would certainly say, well, of course. Do you think Paul would have a problem if I looked at Paul and said, oh, come on, Paul, that's not right. That's just not real. That's not historical. I think I'd get an argument from Paul and from Peter and from Jesus, from James, from the author of Hebrews, from Jude, from John. I think I'd get an argument. They all took Genesis 1 through 3 or 1 through 4 literally. There's no other reason, as you read through those texts, to assume that they didn't. And again, one of the rules of hermeneutics is, unless you are compelled through the text to treat it differently, you start with just the generic, simplest reading first. Isn't that the way we really ought to treat everyone? If I just automatically assumed every time you said something that you meant something else, we'd be in trouble here. So, basically, it messes up our doctrines is the point. If we look at the overall series here, what was my point been for the last 3 weeks? It matters how we interpret the chapters of Genesis because there are rules for interpretation, and they're thrown out all the time by old earth proponents. They are thrown out. They change the rules. They don't follow them properly. And folks, I've only got a Master's of Divinity. I don't have a doctorate degree. I've had 4 years of Greek and 3.5 years of Hebrew. Okay? Does not make me a scholar. But when I can tell when I see an Old Testament scholar start to say, that doesn't really mean that. It doesn't take a scientist to see that. But yet, that's what happens. They throw out the rules. It matters because mankind is at the center of God's creation. And that's missed in this, folks. The process of evolution and uniformitarianism completely ignores the fact that everything that God has done here in creation was done for our benefit, that we might have a place to live, that we might have a place to serve and honor our God. And you see that in Genesis chapter 1. You see that throughout the Old Testament. Lastly, it matters because the writers in the New Testament all relied on the historicity of it to make their points, to support our doctrines. In closing, I want to read one last thing that I think makes the point. I've tried to give you some examples. I'm not naming names and stuff just to point fingers and to be arrogant. I think it helps to have some examples. But I got this. It's a Creation magazine. It's from Creation Research. And it's kind of an interesting thing. It's an article about a missionary, a Southern Baptist missionary from the 1800s named Lottie or Lodi Moon. You may have heard of her. There are Christmas offerings given every year in her memory, and they're the largest single Christian offerings given at any time during the year. Anyway, there's an interesting thing because she was partially led to Christ by an individual who happened to be a Hebrew and Oriental language scholar by the last name of Toy. And there was a point at which, and she was over in China, that he had proposed to her and wanted to marry her. And she chose not to marry him over this issue. Listen to the summary of his life. Toy, he's a Hebrew scholar and Oriental language scholar. Toy had become involved in controversy. Following the Civil War, he had studied in Europe, absorbing both Darwinism and the higher criticism and rationalism of German scholars, such as, and he mentions a number of them, who denied that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Seeking to harmonize the first chapters of Genesis with the emerging science of his day, he held that the days of Genesis 1 were geographical periods. Now, this is a Hebrew scholar, guys. However, as a Hebrew scholar, he knew that the Hebrew text required that the word day meant a natural day of 24 hours. So he then moved to a different view, that the writer of Genesis was not describing history, but had divided all created things into categories and had assigned them to days for poetic and rhetorical vividness. This too ceased to satisfy him because the Hebrew grammar clearly shows that Genesis is written as historical narrative. This is something he knew. So he eventually began to ask, does not this chapter simply represent the, in his own words, crude, cosmogenic ideas of the Israelites and the Babylonians, from whom the Israelites seem to have gotten them? Sadly, these ideas brought him to the point where he was convinced that the proper approach to the Bible was to, quote, take the kernel of truth from its outer covering of myth. Well, I think this is important. Here was a Hebrew scholar who could see that there was absolutely no way to interpret the text as anything other than historical narrative. But he fought to try to find a way to interpret it as anything other than historical narrative. And in the end, he simply went, it's myth. That's the solution. It's just myth. That's the process that we see happening today. Father, thank you so much for just your wisdom and your insight. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men, and that is so true. When we look at Genesis chapter 1, it does not always jive with scientific consensus. And so many have abandoned a true, sound interpretation of Genesis 1 in favor of scientific consensus. And oftentimes it's for what I would refer to, Father, as good motives. They just don't want it to be a stumbling block. They don't want it to stand in the way of leading people to Christ. And so the answer to that is, well, it just doesn't matter. We shouldn't argue about it. But that's not true. We can see here today that Peter and Paul and Jude and John and how many others, Father, didn't see it that way. It was the basis for our doctrines. In fact, we would not have the concept of sin or the need for a Savior if it weren't for Genesis 1, 2, and 3. We wouldn't have the promise of a resurrection if it wasn't possible for sin to enter through one man. Then it certainly wouldn't be possible for resurrection to come from one man. We thank you for your wisdom, Father, and pray that you might help us to continue to hold strong to these truths and to make your word, not scientific consensus, what drives us. And we pray for all this in Jesus' name. Amen.